Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Mary Briggs. I'm the Director of Research and Education Policy Development at the California School Boards Association. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We have at the California School Boards Association seen in the last 9 months really dramatic impacts due to the coronavirus pandemic, and the schools have really made some really tough decisions and faced unprecedented conditions during this period. But one thing has become clear. Not only did the pandemic shine a spotlight on existing inequities in education, but it's also exacerbated those inequities for many of our families. So in response to that, our members have been really focused on thinking about ways that they, as governing board members, can support equity as all of this fluid situation continues to evolve. And as part of that, we, with the support of the Stewart Foundation, have partnered with West Ed to develop some resources for our members, including this webinar today, which is the Equitable Support for California Students during the COVID-19 crisis, and really focusing on the school board perspective, strategies for board members. The next slide, please. Next slide, please. So a few things of housekeeping before we get started on our content. The first thing is that we will have a portion of the presentation set aside for you to submit questions for our presenters after our panel. And so if you have questions, these are the directions where you will go to the questions tab of the dashboard that appears on your screen. And if you don't see it, it might be collapsed. So you look for a little orange arrow at the top right corner of your screen. Click on that arrow and it should expand to the dashboard where you can input your questions. We also have some questions that were submitted when you registered, and we have flagged those as well. One little comment, just as an aside, we have heard reports of different parts of the state that are being impacted by internet connectivity issues. As you know, this is something that all of our families and students and educators have been contending with as we work through these times. So if there are technical glitches, we ask for your indulgence, but we anticipate that today will run smoothly. So at this point, I'll hand this over to my colleague from West Ed, Maria Salsiccioli, if you want to introduce our panel.
Thanks, Mary. As Mary mentioned, my name is Maria Salsiccioli. I'm a researcher at West Ed, and I'm really delighted to be here with all of you today. I'm going to introduce the participants in today's conversation. We have 4 really amazing panelists: Leslie Hamburger, the Area Director of English Learners and Migrant Education Services at West Ed; Jessica Howard, the Chief Executive Officer at Californians Dedicated to Education Foundation; Patricia Love, the Executive Director of Strategy and Communications at the San Mateo County Office of Education; and Jason Willis, the Area Director of Strategic Resource Planning and Implementation at West Ed. Mary and I will be posing them some discussion topics, and then we're going to follow that with a Q&A featuring your questions. And with that, I will ask Leslie Hamburger to kick us off.
Good afternoon. I'm Leslie Hamburger, and it's a pleasure to be with you today to discuss the education of English learners during COVID-19. I direct the English Learner and Migrant Education area at West Ed that is focused on ensuring that English learners and migratory students have full access to learning opportunities that empower them to succeed and fulfill their full potential. Next slide. There are over 1.2 million English learners in California public schools. Every one of them, every single one of them, is immensely capable and brings to school rich experiences, knowledge, and the wonderful potential of being a multilingual speaker and thinker. COVID-19 has exacerbated some of the inequities and challenges that English learners face in accessing powerful learning opportunities that will allow them to develop content knowledge at the same time that they develop language. English learners are disproportionately challenged during these times of school closures and distance learning for basically two main reasons. First, English learners are less likely than other students to have computers and internet access at home. But also, and more importantly, they may have little familiarity with how to access and navigate online learning programs and platforms, or how to set up and use communication applications like video conferencing. In a survey of teachers on how they use digital technologies with English learners, the majority of teachers reported that normally they do not ask English learners to use digital learning resources at home because of fears about their access and also the difficulties that they experience in communicating about technology in a language that is still under development. So this lack of familiarity and fewer family supports that could assist the students are major barriers to access. So equitable access and support for technology use still now, even if in the spring school districts were working on this, still now is something that board members could explore with the districts and their leadership. The second reason is that the medium of online learning presents some challenges for addressing the learning needs of English learners and requires really significant educator expertise. English learners need opportunities to learn that are deep and powerful and that develop content knowledge and language in tandem. They need academic supports that enable them to engage with rigorous texts, ideas, processes, and they need to participate in quality interactions with peers where they are speaking, they're listening, they're responding to each other, they're problematizing about ideas, they are arriving at conclusions. However, this type of learning is difficult at a distance and requires deep teacher expertise. So in a coherent system, we provide equitable access, powerful learning opportunities, and educators develop the capacity to design and enact the types of learning that will challenge and support students at the same time. Teachers need to understand that language develops in use and that they need to craft learning experiences that will engage their students in very abundant language practice. The limitations imposed by distance learning often prevent students from having the robust experiences with ideas and with their peers that will allow them to really develop deep content knowledge and English language proficiency. So board members can really engage with their districts in exploring how English learners are engaging with important central ideas. To what extent are English learners engaging in quality interactions with their peers? Or very importantly, how are teachers developing the expertise to design online learning that can challenge and support English learners? The two briefs that my colleague and I developed on STEM learning during COVID-19 will address some of these ideas in greater depth, in particular about the design of learning experiences in math and science at a distance. Please check them out. But let me introduce and pass this on to our next panelist, Jessica Howard.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad to be with you all today. I want to share my appreciation for the CSBA team, the WestEd team, and all those who are joining us and invited us to talk. Boy, have we all learned a lot this year. It's probably one of the biggest understatements I could make. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Californians Dedicated to Education Foundation, aka CDE Foundation. We are a 501c3 that works extremely closely with the California Department of Education, other statewide partners, regional, and districts in a number of different areas. Typically, it's about established policy and how the rubber is hitting the road in terms of implementation. How do we do it well? What are the conditions that are necessary to do it well? And we've also been asked to do some interesting adaptation this year, as I know we've all experienced because of COVID. So the next slide, I'll walk you through some examples of that. So as was already mentioned, we have inequities that were simply exacerbated or revealed even more starkly by the impacts of COVID. As of May 2020, and this certainly predates when things really started getting into gear with COVID in March in our region, we knew that about 1 in 5 California students lacked the necessary technology and or internet access to succeed in distance learning. So one of the things that we kept in mind and that I'll encourage you to think about here is what things did we already know and what things did we not know? And how can we make sure that we're not caught off guard in the future? One thing we do know is that there will be other emergencies in the future. I know there are lots of communities across California who unfortunately have had to deal with suddenly shutting down schools due to natural disasters or other things that have come up. And we're likely to experience some degree of that moving forward. So how do we create resilience in our districts so that we are better able to tackle that when it comes around? Because unfortunately, we just know it will probably in some shape or form. And as has been already mentioned, we know which student groups are most impacted by the digital divide and a number of other inequities in our system. And that includes English learners, low-income students, students of color, those with housing insecurity, foster youth, those with special learning needs. These are students who have already had a lot of challenges in our existing system. And again, the digital divide simply pulled back the curtain even more starkly on that. A couple of things that have contributed that since before COVID include things like the lack of infrastructure, especially for our rural and frontier communities, lack of affordability, especially in our city and lower income areas all over the state, and simply the fact that we've never necessarily been pushed to this degree of having to consider toggling between our virtual and in-person selves as learners and professionals, let alone as private individuals. So we know that achievement gaps really do widen during absences from school. In the pre-COVID days, we know that from chronic absence data that correlates to student achievement and how that impacts. And we also know that now because of how absences are impacting communities and families and are especially exacerbated by digital divide concerns. And I wanted to point out that we know that technology, a device, won't necessarily solve everything with the digital divide, just as internet access won't necessarily solve everything. It's really an interwoven approach. But one major way that we teamed up with partners is to address the digital divide with the Bridging the Digital Divide Fund. We were asked to host that fund by the Governor's Office, the State Board of Education, and the California Department of Education this March. To date, it has raised $18.3 million that have been channeled to about 29% of districts across California. It's about over 300 districts, and brought, thanks to purchases and in-kind, over 65,000 devices, over 100,000 hotspots to those communities. That was done in very close collaboration, especially with the California Department of Education, and surveys that had been taken to learn where there were the largest gaps in digital divide, and also where the largest gaps in access to purchasing them were. Not only did California and our communities experience a shortage of devices, there was actually a global shortage. So one of the things we were able to do with the Digital Divide Fund by combining our powers as agencies is to recognize and respect local control here in California, but also know that if we can advocate for the entire state of California, for all Californians to have access to devices that were available, given that we're all in the midst of a shortage, we would do so. So in addition to using funds to provide devices and connectivity to various districts and schools, we also negotiated purchasing deals on behalf of the state of California so that districts, as they were using their learning loss mitigation funds, other public dollars, CARES dollars, would have access to supply that otherwise, unfortunately, would probably have gone elsewhere and not necessarily had first dibs for California. So really putting together our power and voice as agencies there was very helpful. A couple other things I want to mention about the digital divide are a few things we learned about that and going through the process of putting it together. Certainly there are plenty of new things. We have a lot of different program areas that we work on, whether it's related to labor and management collaboration, teacher residencies, our STEAM initiatives. All of those are, the motors of them are our ability to connect. And so therefore the digital divide is really core, is foundational to anything else we're trying to do. I know that seems obvious, but when we think about just what it means to allow authentic learning experiences and support people toggling between really unusual circumstances and the anxiety they're in, we often ask ourselves, how can we at least save some dollars, save some stress in terms of providing resources or channeling resources through the Digital Divide Fund. A couple of other lessons we learned, and then I'll pass it off shortly. We realized that something very obvious, but we had to constantly remind ourselves and our partners, and I hope you do as well, none of us has dealt with a global pandemic like this before. How in the world do we know exactly what to do? So it's a matter of all of us working together to figure that out and to give all of ourselves and colleagues and families grace beyond 24 hours, because it's very hard to suddenly pivot in such a short time frame. We knew we had to be nimble and flexible. That means applying the Digital Divide Fund resources also to communities that were impacted by wildfires. So we actually more recently were able to partner in that regard as well. We also knew that this not only impacts students and families, but also administrators, other staff, our educators. A number of them don't necessarily have digital devices and other accessibility setups in their own homes. They may rely on their school infrastructure to do that. So much of the digital divide is also about whether our adults are provided the resources they need to engage as professionals in our system as well. And again, I just want to stress that one way to look forward into the future about this as a board member is to ask, how do we build resilience as a district so that we aren't caught off guard again? How, if we are suddenly supposed to shut down next week or tomorrow, can we already have some things in place so that we can adjust? We know it won't be easy. We know we're gonna have to continue recalibrating when it comes to that. How can we make some investments with our learning loss mitigation funds or otherwise to put ourselves in a position to have the infrastructure to do that, to support our teams with professional development and otherwise to do that, and just make sure that we know that that's unfortunately something that could come down the line and we're able to adjust as necessary. Later on, I'm happy to give more specific examples of how some districts have addressed various impacts they've experienced from COVID. But in the meantime, I'm actually going to pass it off to our next panelist, Patricia Love.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patricia Love from San Mateo County Office of Education. Thank you all for having me here today and for prioritizing equitable support for students. Today, I would like to share a little bit about the process we've used in San Mateo County to help bring students back on campus, help districts develop their reopening plans, and to effectively review those plans that we have received. Regardless of where we are with the blueprint for a safer economy, as most counties are doing, we're kind of been up and down inside the various tiers. Since we believe that getting students on campus for in-person learning and supports is a fundamental equity issue, we have prioritized this work and have worked extensively with schools and districts to help them get students back on campus in a variety of ways and as safely as possible. Last spring, Superintendent McGee, the San Mateo County Superintendent of Schools, Nancy McGee, assembled a team from the county's Coalition of Safe Schools and Communities to research best practices and develop a framework that schools could use to develop their own plans for returning students to school. The result is the Pandemic Recovery Framework. It is centered on equity, based on science, and provides several layers of safety nets, including testing, screening, contact tracing, and then the 4 pillars: health and hygiene, face coverings, physical distancing, and limiting gatherings. And here on the screen, you can see a graphic that has become ubiquitous in San Mateo County schools and districts, capturing the 4 pillars that are critical. So since safety is essential to everyone, especially teachers and families moving forward, to bring their students back, to come back to school, we have focused on that. Next slide. Since we have started this process, we have reviewed 72 waiver requests from schools and school districts. And actually, it's waiver requests and reopening plans when the process switches a little bit as you move through the tiers. And every one of those plans was focused and built on the pandemic recovery framework. So we did this so that schools wouldn't have to waste time kind of doing their own research, hiring their own people. We provided this framework for them to base their plans on. And so in San Mateo County, while we were in the purple, that's where when we joined the Blueprint for a Safer Economy, we ended up in the purple, the most restrictive tier. And schools can only open to serve students in TK to 6 if they had received a waiver approved by the County Office of Education, San Mateo County Health, and the California Department of Public Health. And when we moved to the red tier, the requirement for the California Department of Public Health review ended. However, the San Mateo County Office of Education and our county health department continued to review plans. And so when we moved to orange, we didn't change the process. Everybody thought, oh, will this lighten up? Nothing lightened up. In fact, we had plans to keep this going as we even moved to yellow tiers. And so now, if and when it's expected shortly that we will move back to purple, we have received some plans from districts serving TKs to 6 students that have been approved and gone through the process, but did not open. And because of that, we will then need to ask our county health office to send those plans to the California Department of Public Health as we would a waiver to open. But I think because we've had this nice sort of seamless process we've been able to move back and forth and adapt quickly as we have gone to different tiers. I do want to be clear that it hasn't been, super straightforward and easy. We have this framework and having schools kind of follow it to open their plan. There's been a variety of things we've had to go back and forth with on districts, and some districts and schools we've gone back multiple times trying to support them to kind of get their plans right. A lot of issues we see are just incomplete information on screening, on surveillance testing. A common one we saw early on was we plan to engage with a firm to do testing. And our county health office is clear. We want to see the plan. We don't want to hear that you're going to develop a plan. So we would work with them to make sure they had those things in place before we pass their plan along to our county health reviewers. We had one district that was kind of getting hammered, and we were receiving a lot of complaints and letters from parents and calls about their delaying in getting students back on campus. These are students with the greatest needs. They were really concerned that what hadn't been a priority and the number of pods set up wasn't really quite enough. So it was interesting reading their plan. Equity wasn't even addressed in their plan. So when we spoke to the district, they actually had a really clear plan for bringing students back, but they just didn't communicate it. And so my day job is partially in communications. So that was probably helpful to just sort of point that out as they moved forward with their plan. They just assumed everybody knew that. The pandemic recovery framework provides common language and protocols, which has been really useful to districts, schools, and parents, as well as our early learning communities, county health, county office. We're all talking and using the same language. We all kind of know what a face covering is. We all know when they're required. We all know when they're not required. And another positive about the framework is that we built this with a broad cross section of people from our county, our rural districts, or more urban districts. And so the framework is as relevant to our small rural districts as it is to our larger, more urban districts. We're all speaking the same language, and we're all applying it to our various opening strategies. So I'm happy to kind of wrap up here, share the framework with anybody, the supporting materials. There's a link to our site on this slide. We're happy to give you a Word version if you want to take parts and use it. We're happy to give you our graphics, take our logo off if that's helpful. Whatever we can do to help get students back on campus safely we're happy to help. So thank you very much. I'd now like to turn the slides over to Jason Willis.
Great, thanks so much, Patricia, and really appreciate Leslie and Jessica's opening. As a school board member, part of your responsibility, I think, is largely what you've been hearing from Patricia and from Jessica and from from Leslie in thinking about the well-being of your students, towards the mission and vision that you've set out as an organization, as a school district, a charter school, et cetera. And so thinking about this opportunity, part of my role is to really provide that holistic set of responsibilities. So in addition to those, you also have the fiduciary responsibility of managing the financial health of your organizations. And in such an odd year in so many incredible ways, we obviously have seen a tremendous amount of variability and volatility, both in the economics of public schools, but also in the sheer financing. And I think you've heard some of my fellow panelists already reference that. So I'm Jason Willis. I'm a colleague to Leslie Hamburger at WestEd. We typically do most of our work in the area of school finance, resource planning, and strategy implementation for organizations. And with that, let me talk a little bit about how we're seeing this work unfold in addressing the impacts of the pandemic, but also the growing issues that are coming to the fore in terms of meeting the needs of students. The first place that I would start is that with the local control funding formula, can actually create a critical opportunity framing, not just the way the funds are flowing themselves, but also other critical planning tools, specifically the LCAP within it, to really actualize the equitable delivery of systems. We tend to advance the mantra that having a plan is the first concrete and rigorous step to implementation. And without that plan and understanding how you're going to tackle some of those problems explicitly, it's hard to understand, with so much other variables at play, how you're going to address the needs of students. And in particular, with that document, or perhaps a supplemental document that you all have as a part of as a school board member for your school district, is thinking about the connection that those plans or those strategies have, again, many of which my panelists have been talking a bit about already, and how resources are aligned to help support those things. So when we think about the role of board members, we do believe that there's actually three really critical roles that each of you play with your other fellow board members to represent the governance of school districts in California. And the first one is really ensuring that funds support high needs students through both ongoing mechanisms like the LCFF, as well as one-time funds, which include the CARES Act allocations, but I'll also throw in the COVID mitigation funds that the state redirected in receiving that first federal aid package. And in particular, holding that as central is really important, and asking questions about how funds are flowing to ensure that those students that have the highest needs are getting access to those resources and to those supports are really critical. And in fact, as a part of the kind of prep for our webinar today, some of the briefs that both WestEd and CSBA and others have been working on identified some of these major barriers to student learning. And so they include things like technology and internet access, lack of familiarity with education technology, providing that targeted and differentiated support in a completely new environment for students with these needs, such as English learners or students with disabilities. And all of these present different dimensions of how resources need to be organized to basically help and support students to, again, prevent the kind of further growing gap between students that have these needs and their better off peers. And so attending to the way and thinking about your demographic in your system and how explicitly school district leaders, but also school leaders are really thinking about the allocation of those resources to meet those high needs is very, very important. And in particular, this really is grown out of the research that we've seen that came out of the Great Recession, where the federal dollars were provided, states were cutting budgets along the way, and that largely the needs of high need students and their explicit supports that were necessary were kind of left by the wayside. And so what we saw was less of an investment on a per student basis in those types of students as they were losing revenue from declining budgets. The second point here is really around advancing that mission of the school system. And I think I hit a bit on this just before, but it really is about holding that equitable support and the equitable outcomes of those students at the center of your discussions with school district administrators. And in particular, thinking about bringing those two pieces together of how are you creating strategies to address those points, and then how are you reorganizing resources in a way that address those explicit needs. And in a moment like this, such an extraordinary year, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, we have seen dramatic changes in budgeted line items because of the pandemic itself. And so thinking about how those resources might be reorganized to provide that support is a really critical question. And as a former chief financial officer, chief business officer in school districts in California, I do hesitate a bit to go down this route around the third bullet. But I do think in this moment, it is extraordinarily important to think about your role as a school board member as a partner to district administrators and school leaders in really helping them to think through some of these critical challenges, especially if you have professional background, in the healthcare sector, or you're a member of a community organization that can kind of bring that information to bear as the environment is changing so incredibly rapidly. And in particular here, typically school board members should be staying at the policy level, and I think that that's very sound and clear advice that CSBA and others have always promoted. But I think in those moments where you are talking about the execution of strategies and talking about the resources itself and how they're being used, asking really critical questions about the use of those resources to bring them to the surface count a lot, right? So let me give you one example of this, a couple on the slide, but I think this one kind of hits home. Bandwidth is a really important element of the delivery of instruction now through distance learning, right? So in order for a teacher to be sitting at a laptop, to access the internet, and then to deliver that to his or her students in whatever form, if it's a full class session, or if it's small groups, or it's a one-on-one session, it's important that both the teacher and the student has the appropriate bandwidth to handle whatever it is that you're trying to do at that moment. So something that requires significantly less bandwidth is probably accessing a Google Doc, for example, and typing together if you're working on a writing lesson. Something that requires a lot more bandwidth is being on video for an hour or 2 hours to ensure that you can see and interact with the teacher or with other students. In both of those circumstances, they require really different bandwidth, right? And so when you're thinking about the investments that the district is making to ensure that students are being reached to come into that learning environment, we heard a little bit about this in terms of the inability for students to access, which leads to a lack of attendance, which contributes to that learning loss, asking those questions around what is the available bandwidth for those students, so that if you're thinking about providing a laptop to all the students, that is certainly a great step forward. But then you also have to think about how are they going to access the internet, and is the bandwidth that they're in a household for going to be sufficient to sustain that connectivity throughout the course of synchronous learning, for example. So let's move on to the next slide. I was talking a bit about the kind of fiduciary responsibility and your role in basically approving budgets at the first interim, second interim, at times third, but also the adopted budget. And I think it's important to note that you are going to see in this current year's budget substantial shifts in a number of those expenditure line items, including how you're paying for certificated staff and classified staff, but also for many of your non-labor items. And again, this is due to the extraordinary shift that school districts and charter schools, virtually every education environment, has had to go through in moving to distance learning. And so you're highly likely to see substantially less investment in your labor items, particularly around stipends, substitute teachers, for example, and along with that will come reductions in your benefits as compared to the budget that was probably established in July. Now, where you're likely to see increases is, again, those line items I was just referencing with that specific example around investments in technology, investments in hotspots, or an ability to kind of connect that laptop to the internet to keep a class or a school connected together. And in particular, I think it's important to be attentive to thinking about how this coming year's budget is going to apply to next year, to FY22. And we've seen a couple of things in our environment that, again, are just dramatically and rapidly shifting. So the announcement of 2 vaccines that are likely to be kind of widespread and available likely by the fall or the winter of next year, according to the press. You're likely to see some potential opportunities to return to some form of in-person instruction at that time. But I think another factor that we're really wrestling with here is, could there be a segment of the school's population that doesn't return at all, that actually prefers to be in a virtual learning environment substantially higher than what we've experienced in the past? On average in California, before the pandemic hit, independent study or virtual instruction constituted less than 1.5% of the entire state student population. That has surged through the pandemic to obviously substantial levels. And even, through anecdotal evidence, what we're seeing is when you poll parents and you poll students themselves, there's a pretty substantial proportion of them, 10, 15, 20%, that might prefer to stay in that virtual environment. And that's going to require, again, a rethinking of the way that the district comes to meet the needs of students. And again, I go back to this notion of what is going to be important is holding at the center how you ensure that you are delivering equitable opportunities for these students. So even while a student might prefer to stay virtual, thinking about their needs and thinking about their learning stance is going to be really substantial, and you offering some advice to say, hey, maybe this is an opportunity or a space that you want to perform in, but there might be some other things that we need to supply in order to make sure that you're getting the support you need, given what your trajectory as a K-12 student is. So I'll pause there, and I'll turn it over to Maria, and looking forward to getting into our discussion.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. So right now we have a few things for you to consider as we move into the discussion portion of the webinar. For you as board members, take some time to think about the considerations we're discussing and what might be relevant for your district, questions you might still have, things you might want to learn more about, ways that you can provide support locally, and information you can bring back to your district. And so with that, Mary will get our discussion going.
Wonderful. So we'll start with Patricia. You described a little bit about your framework for reopening in San Mateo County. One of the things we often hear from our members is kind of like, what does it look like in the process of the development? So if you could describe developing your reopening plan and also what it looks like. One of the things that we were really impressed with San Mateo was, again, that focus on equity. So if you want to talk a little bit about the specific ways that you're addressing the needs of our more vulnerable students, that would be great as well.
Sure, thank you. So this started in the spring. We have in San Mateo something called the Coalition for Safe Schools and Communities. It was formed after Newtown, and this group represents a lot of different government agencies in the county, various partners, and is responsible for putting together the Big Five, which are the emergency protocols that we have in the state, as well as our suicide protocols, a lot of things. So we have sort of a history here of working collaboratively with county health, with county council, with our school districts. So that's the group that kind of came together. We're putting little research teams. We studied all the various guidance studies and such, and then brought it back and targeted like health issues and legal issues and school issues and learning issues. But fundamental to all of that was equity, and that was really why we started the work. Was that it was important. We could already see, as everybody could see in the spring, that distance learning was not really working for a lot of students, especially our students with the greatest need. So we wanted to make sure that it was as easy as possible for school districts to develop their own plans to reopen. So that's what the framework does. It just provides, you can go into the framework and pull out all the things you need pretty much to develop a plan and just apply it to your school district. And so this is we also have worked closely with districts that have sometimes wanted to put in a plan, but they were only going to bring in really small groups. And so it was actually more advantageous for them to use the cohorting guidance provided by the state, which would allow them to do it in purple, red, orange, anytime. They could bring in small groups of students for targeted supports, and they would just follow the 4 pillars. And that's what a lot of districts did, because they really, you know, with unions and other issues, couldn't really like reopen. And so this was just another way of getting those kids who need it the most on campus. And that's not just even for academic things. It's really, as we were seeing, the mental health impact is unbelievable. And so just having that connection with an adult who cares about you on school, even if they're bringing them in 1 day a week for a couple hours just to like kumbaya, you know, talk, connect, how are you doing? Super great benefits. And so that's what we've been trying to support. And like, what's the best tool for you to do it? Is it cohorting? Is it a plan? And it also depends on if we're in purple, red, and orange, what your options are.
Thank you. Before I hand this over for our next question, I just want to point out we've received a question about whether or not folks will have access to the slides. As Patricia had in her slide, a link to the resources that San Mateo County has developed. And yes, you will receive, if you've registered for the webinar, you will receive both a copy of the recording of this webinar as well as the slides that go along with it, and they'll be available on our website. Maria?
Thanks, terrific. Leslie, we were hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about things to know about English learners in the COVID context. And so you started touching on that in your introductory remarks, but if you could say a little bit more for everybody, be terrific.
Sure. So I think one of the things that I want us to be thinking about is that as we experience a longer stretch of time engaged in distance learning, and English learners are experiencing greater gaps in learning, and their participation, their attendance, their achievement decreases over time, the reaction is going to be, when we get to more normal situations in some way, is to retrench and think about doing, going back to the basics and filling in gaps and taking the approach that we need to remediate. And I want us to really very carefully that is not the path to go down. You've got to think that English learners, what they are going to need is enrichment, acceleration, better and deeper opportunities. Because the reason they're suffering right now is because the learning experiences that they are having are not robust enough, deep enough. They do not engage the students in the kind of talk and in reading and discussion and interactions that really advance language learning. So that's the first thing that I would say, that we need to be careful that we question what are our reactions to the gaps in learning that are happening. A second thing is that I think we want to make sure that we are strongly monitoring and advocating that English learners are assigned to the most challenging level courses that they can. That the issue is not about not providing challenge, it's about providing the supports so that students can really achieve very high. And so it's about advocating about student placement, it's advocating about accelerating options for English learners to learn, and it's also about advocating to make sure that English learners, because of their language proficiency, are not excluded from advanced math classes or are not excluded from the enrichment opportunities that they should have, or that they end up losing the arts in service of trying to do makeup things. So those would be things that I would say are important to think about at this point.
Great, thank you very much, Leslie. So this question is for Jessica, and you brought up a lot of great background and kind of information about what the state has been doing, particularly through the CDE Foundation, in terms of addressing the digital divide. And we know that it has the potential to really exacerbate learning gaps. And So we'd love to hear a little bit more about some strategies that you've seen districts use to address the digital divide, and maybe some places where you've seen some promising practices emerge or approaches.
Sure, I'm happy to. There's nothing like a crisis to make us get extremely innovative because we have no other choice. So we've seen a lot of people lean into that. I've thought about this in a few different categories, so I'll share some examples. That's just a tip of the iceberg in terms of what we've seen so far. But what I will say, I think an overarching principle that we've noticed, those who are having longer term success are thinking of this from a prevention mindset. How are we preventing learning loss? How are we preventing things getting further exacerbated in terms of inequities? What is our short-term but also longer-term plans to make sure that what we're trying to answer for now will put us in a better position in the future? So I'll point to some specific examples. One is the importance of labor and management collaborating effectively. There also is an essential role for school board members in those conversations. And what we found is that a number of districts, San Juan Unified included, have put together side letters and MOUs to find ways to collaborate and agree on some things. They're not reopening negotiations, but they are saying we need to find a way from the beginning to have all of us in the same room to try to problem solve here. And I would say, we've learned, for example, we recently came out with a report about how Dinuba Unified worked together to help with the health of their labor and management collaboration that actually put them in a better position to then respond to COVID once it emerged, because they had already established some norms and practices of collaboration and really worked on the relationships among their leaders in those organizations, as well as working with their school board, so that they were better able to tackle just something challenging that came across their way. And the major something we all know this year has been COVID. What else might they be able to do now that they've strengthened their ability to collaborate in general as professionals in this world? In terms of teacher prep, we found examples in teacher residency model, more specifically. For those of you unfamiliar with that, it's akin to the medical model of a resident having a mentor and shadowing an in-service professional. And in this case, there are a lot of different ways that we bring educators into the field, but for residencies, we found that mentors who are master educators are suddenly not necessarily feeling so master right now because they're switching to technology or other tools that they're less familiar with. So as they make that adjustment and continue to work together for support, having a resident with them for an entire year as an extra set of hands has been a way to make sure that they can more equitably pay attention and engage with families and students, and just frankly adjust themselves to the situations they're finding themselves in. We've also found some organizations like Romoland Unified use this and their CARES dollars, which are linked to the learning loss mitigation dollars I mentioned earlier, as an opportunity to go one-to-one. They had wanted to. This is a chance to make sure they can make that foundational investment to go one-to-one with their student body. And then a couple more things I'll mention is we have seen people use this as an opportunity, again, with the sort of looking forward approach, to revamp their educational technology policies. Did they even have a robust one? What does that mean not only for those who are specialists in that area, but also for everyone in the district? How are they understanding the role of education technology and what our expectations are? Jason, I really appreciate what you brought up earlier in terms of bandwidth and types of devices needing to be sufficient for what we're actually trying to do here. Think about that in even a multi-school age child household. How is the bandwidth going to make sure that they can all be on Google Classroom and Zoom and whatever together? One other thing I wanted to mention, a couple other things I wanted to mention. One is we found districts like Glendale Unified and others decide that they were going to have, using frameworks such as those from San Mateo and otherwise, what was their specific district approach to educational technology and addressing the digital divide? Have they looked at what the sort of base information is of what their divide is? Did they know what it was prior to COVID? To what degree? What student subgroups had they investigated? Had they been asked about perhaps by their board members to take a look at to make sure that they were aware, so they had a baseline to see what was being exacerbated or not? And finally, one thing I want to stress about the digital divide here is the more we can support the professionals in our work to succeed and adapt, not because it will be easy, but because it can be done, the more we will have them stay in the field. We know that the teacher shortage has always been a challenge for education. It continues to get worse. And turnover is actually an issue for 9 of 10 spots that we're trying to fill here in the state of California. There's some great research from WestEd and Learning Policy Institute that will help you give more background on that. But if we are able to support people in surviving the digital divide, closing it, and understanding how to engage with it and toggle between their virtual and in-person identities in the education sector, they're more likely to stick around. And so that retention issue, how it leads to longer term planning around our shortages, will have a big impact on us surviving and thriving beyond COVID.
We have a question for Jason that others may have points they'd like to add on to it once he's given some broader context. And it's a question about funding. So funding is very obviously critical in providing an equitable education. And thinking about ways that districts and counties can focus their spending beyond what you've told us so far, do you have any additional recommendations, ways that board members can start to sink their teeth in, anything else that you'd want people to know?
Yeah, I wanted to offer, I can offer certainly some thoughts on that, but I do want to underscore one of the things that Jessica was saying around the technology piece, and in particular, given just the swell of demand, we're kind of past that kind of initial wave, but being very kind of attuned to price gouging. We experienced this in the early days of the pandemic around is it incubators or basically the device that helped people to breathe while they had the virus. And in particular, we see that with just about anything that turns into a commodity. If it's a laptop, if it's cameras, other devices that would be procured for those reasons. And so I just offer the advice that there are mechanisms. The state has one of the biggest ones, just in purchasing power alone. I think it's worth noting we live in the 6th largest economy in the world, so we've got a little bit of weight to throw around when it comes to like pushing down the price. And while it may take a little bit longer, maybe a couple of extra weeks, for example, to procure some of those additional devices, when you're talking about saving a couple $100 on 1,000 or 10,000, even 100,000 devices, it can make a really big difference as we're trying to really make the best of the limited resources we have in public education. Maria, to the question that was asked about other ways to be thinking about the equitable distribution of resources, I think this really follows from the architecture of the LCFF. So you've got your base level of funding, you've then got supplemental and concentration funds that are intended to address improved and increased services for specifically low-income English learner and foster youth students. And I would think critically about where you're spending those funds and if ultimately those students are really achieving, they're getting those increases and improvements in services. When I was with San Jose Unified, we had the opportunity basically to completely recalibrate the way that we were distributing staff. Some districts do it on the basis of a per student allocation. Most districts think about the vast majority of their resources through their people. So if you're talking about repurposing instructional aides or instructional coaches or other specialists that are focused on providing programming, that is the critical way to be thinking about where you are pushing that support, especially into certain schools, schools that might have younger teachers. As Jessica was saying, we continue to experience a crisis in a shortage of teachers, but now it seems like a lot of people have regressed trying to figure out how do I navigate a digital environment to really kind of reach my students and be effective in that. So thinking about those kinds of existing positions, and if you're going to hire on new positions, how you prioritize the needs of students is really important. And I love just the framing that Leslie offered, and then I'll pause and let my other panelists jump in here. And I apologize, I have to step off in a couple of minutes for a personal obligation I couldn't get out of. But Leslie talked about getting out of this mindset of thinking about, what did you say, Leslie, was remediation, right? Like the going back to the basics, right? Like that's almost like, that feels really comfortable and that feels really sound, right? Like, let's just get back to the basics. Like, let's just reestablish the foundation. I think it's worth noting, and I'll say it because I know Leslie was thinking it. It wasn't working before the pandemic. Like these gaps were substantial. We are not getting what we need out of the public education system. Now, you know, I'm a school finance guy, and I have lived in and continue to live in the case to be made about additional investments in public education. I think there are cases to be made for that. And we have to think about how to use our existing set of resources the best way that we possibly can. And I think Leslie's framing of thinking about how to accelerate and enrich, especially with students that likely have been getting isolated, have been getting kind of boxed into a certain way of thinking about how they are supposed to, quote, learn, is something we got to blow the doors off of, right? And I get Jessica's point about labor, and you got to roll through those bargaining tables, which could be really tough sometimes, but getting to that common vision about how you want to think about refreshing what we think about learning and how we think about it, especially relative to these students that are furthest from opportunity, I think is where you get a lot more press in the effective use of resources when you're redesigning the system for better learning, and then you're applying those resources towards that end. So I'll pause there, Marie, and let others jump in on that question too.
I'll just chime in on the spirit and tone of what you mentioned, Jason. This has been an incredibly difficult time. It's also an incredibly exciting time to make some big shifts that are long overdue. And in terms of creativity, I mean, the state of California decided to have more flexibility for its expanded learning dollars because that's what we suddenly needed to pivot to do earlier this year. That's a big choice. There are lots of other big choices we can make if we see this as an opportunity to finally be bold and move forward into the future we know will really serve more of our students.
Thank you. So this could be approached a little, this next question could be approached a little bit from the resources side or, you know, in other ways, but one of the things we've heard from a lot of our members is really thinking about how the context, the local context, impacts districts and counties' ability to respond to COVID. And we have a significant number of rural students in California. And I know, Jessica, you know, you can speak a little bit to the digital side because really you mentioned infrastructure. And one of the things that we also have talked about is bandwidth. So, you know, what a hotspot can accomplish in certain areas is very different. But if you could talk about the rural context and special supports that districts and counties might need during this time, and maybe ways that districts and counties can work either together or, you know, within their local community to help meet the equity needs of their students. Jessica, maybe if you want to start with the digital side, since that's one we definitely hear a lot about.
Sure. I'm going to turn the tables on it for a second and talk about the digital divide before all of this for rural and frontier, let alone what's happened. When you have to drive 4 hours one way to go to a meeting with colleagues in person, having stuff be in person, even pre-COVID, is a challenge. How can our digital tools actually serve rural and frontier communities effectively, no matter what, to save a lot of time and investment and a lot of other things that they are managing? In terms of now, I really appreciate your point about hotspots being useful in different ways, in different places. We did not send the over 100,000 hotspots to places where that hotspot would just sit there and look nice and not actually connect to anything. It's really important, as was brought up before, for administrators and school board members to be aware of what is the actual connectivity, what is available in the area. And is it something where actually, as a board member advocating for broadband, for the infrastructure of what the state at scale can do, will have a huge impact on what your local rural and frontier communities will be able to do. I could go on, Mary, but I think just having that big picture of this being a longer term issue before and after COVID, in terms of the promise of the connectivity, is something that board members can really elevate in conversations and advocacy.
Thank you. Leslie, Patricia, are there things that kind of rise to the top when you think about the rural context for our students? Oh, Patricia, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So the digital divide is just an enormous part of it. You just can't get past that even in San Mateo County. And our county board of supervisors, the county staff did a whole bunch of research sort of looking at a survey of districts, like how is connectivity for all their different students, and they have put in money to try and a whole variety of different solutions to try to address that. So that has been fabulous because that is just a continuous issue, and something that Jessica kind of said, like we're trying not to use the word normal, like we get back to normal. We're trying to like we're moving forward. We're not going back to how it was. We're going to a new place. So I think that's just an important like mind shift that we all have to make as we go forward. In our key rural district, they have done a lot of interesting things. They have used that cohorting guidance that was available to bring students on campus. And they were even looking at like doing it in a variety of like on farms, like creating little learning hubs on farms so students whose parents might be working on those farms could access learning that way. So, you know, those are just a couple of the things, but the digital divide has been a large piece. But creativity, I think, is coming out in spades these days.
Great. So I think we have time for one more of our panel questions before we switch over to questions from our participants today. So I think, Maria, if you want to ask our last panel question.
Absolutely. So we have a bit of a broader question for you. What advice do you have for newly elected board members? And that could range from anything to thoughts about planning, assessment, anything that you feel is really helpful for them to be thinking about right now.
I'll jump in on the assessment piece because I didn't get to say much about that earlier. This is a difficult year for thinking about assessments in general, but it is particularly complicated with English learners because we don't necessarily have adequate data from the prior school year that we typically use for student placement, for instructional decisions, for all kinds of things. So one of the things that I would say is to think carefully about the role of assessments in this year and how do we use information to really advance student learning. And so my number one recommendation was to think about the role of formative assessment, so assessment that happens within learning to inform learning decisions and teaching decisions in the moment, rather than thinking about summative assessments like end of year, end of course, or state assessments, because those are not going to be very valid in the context in which we are, or we were just simply not going to happen. And then the second thing about assessments that I would say to think about is that we want to encourage school districts to be really creative about using formative assessments that encourage a variety of modalities, because that actually can advance learning for English learners when they are being asked to demonstrate learning in a variety of modalities where they speak and they listen and they write and they read and they do a variety of things with language to demonstrate their learning. That actually supports the development of language proficiency. And then the final thing is that I think for every student, this is the year to get started into really thinking of assessments, not as capturing deficits that students have or gaps that students have, but actually about using assessments to measure growth and progress. What is actually being developing? So I suggest that we help, as a board member, you help by questioning and probing, you help school districts really think about differently about the role of assessments at this time.
so I will jump in now. I don't feel qualified at all to give any advice, but just a couple suggestions. I think finding that balance between you know, offering advice and keeping the district focused, and then that bigger picture is really important. I think for board members who seem to be really successful, they are not like in the weeds, kind of questioning decisions left and right. They're like, here, we're about equity. How are we doing on that measurement? Tell me how we're doing. You know, they're not necessarily like, if you do this or you move a teacher here, right? They have the big picture. And then lobbying the state and working with CSBA and really trying to like get big change in education that benefits all students. I think so, finding that like higher up level and then letting the people, the schools kind of do it, but making sure that you're getting the outcomes that you want. That's, I think, the trick is finding that balance.
I think that's really an important point. It's one that Jason raised about the idea of, you know, looking at the policy level. CSBA is really engaged also a lot in working with the state and federal level in terms of larger scale changes. I'll just throw a shameless plug for CSBA and just say, we have many new members as a result of the recent elections, and in addition to the new trustee training, if you're looking for resources, we have number one, resources related to equity on our website under the governance and research briefs, and so they give kind of high level overviews of evidence-based practices around a variety of issues that will face you from the dais. And I think the other piece, if you're thinking specifically about responding to the educational conditions in this time, at the end of this presentation, we have a page that CSBA has developed related to COVID-19 that you know, I think those are good places to start and understanding your role at the policy level. So I think that's great. So I think, Jessica, did you want to step in for an additional comment, or?
Oh, I'm happy to just offer a couple of kernels of thoughts to answer the question, and also say +1 to what Patricia said about balancing, you know, policy level and asking the right questions. One, I just want to say, we have a hybrid future. Our distance learning curve has not been fun, but we're never going back to having the digital world, you know, play a minimal role in any of our system. So to know that is the case moving forward, I think is really instructive in terms of how you might see your new position. Welcome, by the way, to the fray. I'll just add a couple more things. One is, if conversations around mental health and the well-being of your students, families, staff, educators aren't a part of the way you're thinking about responding to COVID in your position, then I think you're missing out on a really important element of anyone surviving with what we're all dealing with right now. It is one thing to have really great math instruction. It's another to even be in the headspace to be able to either teach that or experience that, let alone to have the technology to do it. And then the last thing, I'll just give another plug, and related to your involvement with CSBA and sort of the broader voice, you have an incredible platform to be a voice for our education system and your communities. We need the right infrastructure in this state so that the digital divide does not continue to separate out communities from opportunities. So CSBA is a fantastic organization to elevate your voice, come together and advocate on that California scale to make big policy changes that then will make big differences in your unique community settings.
Thank you. So if we want to advance the slides for the Q&A discussion with our participants' questions. Okay, so as you can see here, and many of you have already entered questions, you know, you can type your questions into the questions tab of the dashboard that should be on the right-hand side. I know that Jason Willis was unable to stay on for this portion, and I see that we have a question directed specifically towards him. We will try to get back to you via email on that. But at this point, Maria?
We've got,
Yeah, go ahead.
A couple questions that were submitted, not just during the webinar, but also in advance. And so I'll open up with one of those. And this is obviously squarely in Leslie's area of expertise, but Patricia and Jessica may also have points to add on here. A board member wanted to know what we can do for students whose parents don't speak English. So in terms of maybe any tips you have for communicating with the family and also making sure the students are getting what they need, what might you suggest?
So I think a few general recommendations are to think about the ways in which communities communicate. So what are the the vehicles and the tools and the devices and the community resources that they normally tap into? So one of the things, for example, that immigrant communities use WhatsApp extensively because they use it to communicate with families at home, wherever home is. So that can be a vehicle for connecting with people. So that's one thing. The issue of a language barrier in communicating with parents is an issue that has solutions. So you can get all kinds of resources for translation, for interpretation. You can get sort of many school districts have services that they contract where you can call a number where you're having a sort of a three-way conversation. There's an interpreter, there's the parent, there's the school official. Those kinds of things are available, and I would highly recommend them. And then the other thing is to think about the role of community organizations, because community organizations have typically very strong connections and understand how to connect with parents in ways that can be of service to school districts.
I think those are really great points. I'm going to chime in with one thing that I've been really pleased to see, and it actually speaks to something Leslie raised earlier in terms of thinking about parents of English learners and the technical side of engaging with distance learning. We've seen several districts where they have made very intentional efforts to provide tech support in students' home languages and the parents' home languages. And in fact, after one district, I can't even remember the name of the specific district, but one district realized that those tech support people were often answering the same questions for families. So they recorded videos, that address certain areas, or, that they've been really intentional about thinking about the connection between digital aspects and the technical side, and supporting the families where the primary language is not English in the home. I think that's really important.
Patricia or Jessica, did you want to add anything to sort of help board members think about connecting with English learners and their families?
Oh, you're on mute again, Patricia, sorry.
I think those are all excellent ideas. I'll help you move on to another question if you like.
I'm happy to add something quickly. We've actually in some ways been closer than ever in terms of how closely the education system, especially teachers, have to partner with parents. We are partners in all of this. We're also closer than ever in a way in the fact that all of our eyeballs are looking at the same thing. We're all stuck on screens, as we all are at this moment, right? So I think the point of pre-recording, of thinking through from the beginning how your plan to address the digital divide thinks about equity, especially for lingual diversity from the beginning, that needs to be another thing that's part of any of your policies that you're approaching it.
Thank you. So one of the other challenges that governing board members are facing at this point is the fact that the ground is always shifting under our feet. And the stakes are really high. So have any ideas that you have about the best way to share constantly changing information with families in districts, keeping that flow of information useful when things are always in flux.
I think some of the things we just spoke about earlier are how we're going to do that. You know, figuring out what the social media channels are the parents are on, setting up a system that you post key information, for example, on a website, and then all of your auxiliary things like emails and social media all direct people back to one source of information. So it's definitive. It's not, well, the email said this and the WhatsApp posting said this. So I think that's just the general strategy, and then to keep it up to date. You can't have a website that you're not updating at least every week with new information. And another key thing is for the boards, please make sure that you are having the staff summarize your board meetings and getting those out to people. We've had a lot of people ask us, like, why isn't our district board, why don't we know what they're doing and what they're deciding, especially during these times where are we opening or not opening, what's going on. It just really helps with transparency.
Thank you. So another question that's equity related, and maybe Leslie, this kind of addresses the assessment side. We've heard a lot of concerns about grading during this time and assessment of student learning because the environments are so different. You know, we don't have necessarily equitable environments for our students who are engaging in distance learning, and therefore we have to think about what things like assessment and grading do in terms of equity. So Leslie, you know, from an assessment piece.
It's difficult. So I think my last point about assessment is to think about grading in terms of growth and progress. So not in terms of really focusing on summative grades, but actually thinking about how to use grades to reflect how students have moved from point A to point B. Like over the course of this unit on, I don't know, chemical reactions. How did the students go from the beginning to the end in making progress in understanding the ideas about chemical reactions, being able to carry out the problems and processes that are entailed in that, and being able to communicate those ideas. So how are they writing about chemical reactions and explaining about their labs, or constructing a simulation that reflects what they have understood about chemical reactions. So I think the key principle to think about is that the role of grading should be capturing students' growth in this particular time. Something that is a little more problematic, but something to think about is a lot of educators are thinking about how do you use grades to capture processes in learning. So, for example, that are required for learning. So, for example, I mentioned how English learners needed to be engaged with peers in abundant levels of talk, because that's how they're going to develop understanding of ideas, but that's how also they advance, they develop language. So do we provide grades to incentivize that kind of talk? And do we provide grades to capture the level of student engagement in those kinds of interactions? The reason why that has to be careful and nuanced is you don't want to penalize somebody who doesn't have the adequate bandwidth to be on Zoom during a breakout room, right? But you do want to be able to ensure that students are engaging in the learning experiences that are going to advance their learning. And then my final point is that I think this is the time, one of the advantages maybe of distance learning is the ability to really hone in on an element of instruction that is key for learning, which is the development of metacognition. For learning to occur, the learner needs to be constantly reflecting on what am I learning, where am I getting stuck, what are the best strategies for learning, what do I need to do next to be able to learn the next thing. And so actually advancing student self-reflection, students' own assessments of their learning is something for which distance learning is very well suited. And so if we could incentivize that kind of conception of grading, it would be very helpful.
Thank you. Mary, do you think we have time for maybe one more question?
I think so. Looking through those questions that we aren't able to get to now, we will do our best to respond individually after. I think Eric Joyce raises a question about that balance that we've discussed earlier. I'm not sure that we'll have huge novel responses to this, but I think it's important to kind of reinforce this piece of how we stay out of the weeds when we have these monumental transitions between the different kinds of offerings that we're able to build. You know, it says offerings built so firmly on the details. Has the role of the board member changed in a pandemic system, in a pandemic situation? I know that none of you currently are serving as board members, but you know, we can talk a little bit about the policy level. I think Jason spoke to the issue of there are going to be times when board members bring specific expertise to their role, you know, whether they're coming from a public health background or a technology background. But I do think that having an awareness of what that entails is really important. I think part of it also is just a trust in your superintendent and a good relationship with your superintendent to know that you can raise questions about issues, but the kind of trust that you provide in responding to how they're managing it on a day-to-day basis is really something that hopefully you have a strong admin team to work with. Are there any other comments related to that out of the weeds piece?
Well, I think
Patricia?
that you can stay out of the weeds, but be informed. And so asking really good questions and really understanding how a system works is really important. And that's the benefit you get by being a little bit farther back, because you can see the system, kind of analyze and understand where it maybe needs some work, maybe more so than the people who are really just right in the weeds. So I think that's important. The other thing I think that is valuable, and if other counties are doing this, I don't know, but the San Mateo County School Boards Association is a phenomenal group. And what they have did during the heavy days of COVID for months and months, they had a weekly meeting with any of their board members, with the San Mateo County Superintendent of Schools. And so she was keeping them up to date constantly on what was going on with the state, what's the latest from California Department of Public Health, whatever was going on. And so they were brought along all the time. And as I was talking about this like common language, they all knew what 4 pillars were, and they all had sort of a great understanding. And now we've moved to once a month with those meetings, but those have been, I sit in on those meetings, I don't really participate, but I just hear the learning and discussion. I think it's phenomenal. So I feel like that's a nice place to land as well.
Right. Well, thank you very much. If you want to advance to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the upcoming resources that we have. So as we mentioned, this webinar today in part was the result of a collaboration with CSBA staff and WestEd, funded through the Stewart Foundation. Part of that, as you heard little hints about, is that we will have some forthcoming briefs that relate to equity. Some of these also were funded through the Bechtel Foundation, the ones that relate to STEM. So we're in the process right now of finalizing those briefs, but we hope that you look for them in the coming month or two. The things related to challenging and supporting English learners in STEM learning at a distance, as well as formative assessment. So Leslie was involved with those with her co-author, Haywin. And making STEM accessible and engaging for students with disabilities, which unfortunately we did not have much time to talk about today during our webinar. And as well, barriers that families and caregivers experience. Just overviews, these would be really good for new board members, and strategies to address them, and the disparate impact of learning loss on student understanding. Although, as Leslie mentioned, you know, keeping an eye on assets and moving forward, I think is really important. And then if we look at our last slide, broader beyond today, if you could advance to the next slide, please. We have at CSBA several resources related to this. Number one is that we have a series of webinars and videos related to education during the pandemic, as well as issues like STEM and equity that you can access through our YouTube channel, which is displayed here on the left side of your screen, as well as our hub of information for news and resources for you related to coronavirus. So we highly encourage you to, you know, in one of those moments where you're all your free time as a trustee in these challenging moments, to really kind of dive into specific issues, or you know, if you missed the name of a particular resource, you know, that you can access them here. So thank you very much for your participation today. We really appreciate your joining us during the middle of your workday. And I want to thank our panelists, so Maria and Leslie, Jason, who was here earlier, Patricia and Jessica. We greatly appreciate all of your insights today.